Hi there, Jonathan here. The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website where you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. That's at www.jonathanfoust.com. Thank you and enjoy. I think I had mentioned Sokni Rinpoche, who's a wonderful teacher. Whenever he would be giving a talk and a cell phone would go off, he would always say, "I hope it's good news." So my dad had a really good sense of humor. When he was diagnosed with dementia and early Alzheimer's, he sent me an email and he said, "Well, the good news is pretty soon I'm going to be able to hide my own Easter eggs." He had a lot of humor going into his demise, but he also went through a lot of struggle. And I wanted to educate myself as to how to be with someone moving into dementia and then into full-blown Alzheimer's. And there's a wonderful book called The 36-Hour Day that's produced by Johns Hopkins. It's like in its 15th edition now. And one thing I learned from that book was what's called catastrophizing. You know, that when the mind is trying so hard to keep everything linear, but when just information drops out or consciousness drops out, then there's sort of the shock and this catastrophizing, which might show up as anger, or it might show up as withdrawal or depression, or it might show up as freezing inside. You know, so it was very, very helpful to recognize that as he moved into more disruptions in his linear thinking, that when he would go into catastrophizing, there were certain things I could do that would support him through that. And I began to recognize how catastrophizing is something we all do. You know, we're all trying to keep this linear sense of some semblance of control in our life, and of course, it drops out. Reality doesn't cooperate with us all the time. And so when that happens, then we experience anxiety, or we experience fear, we experience that internal clench that something is wrong. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm thinking of as the movement from anxiety to wise action. You know, how do we navigate when you're caught in anxiety to translate into action that moves you forward in a wholesome and a really positive way? So one way to think about it that I'd like to explore in the next little while really follows the sort of the basic tenets of Buddhist psychology, what are referred to as the Four Noble Truths. That talks about the nature of stress and suffering. First, that it happens to everyone. Stress and suffering, dissatisfaction, it comes with one of these portable flesh units. The second point is that there's a cause. There is a direct cause for stress, suffering, and anxiety. The third point is that there's a remedy. And the fourth is that there's a path. There are techniques, there are technologies, there are teachings that can help you to move from being less anxious to a greater sense of freedom. So anxiety is just part of our life. Maybe you saw the recent article in the New York Times. I believe it was the New York Times. That was trying to figure out why. I think it's like 69% of the woolly mammoth fossils were male. No one could figure out why. And so a theory started to develop that the females were guided by sort of the wise matriarchs. And these sort of wise matriarchs were able to kind of keep the herd together. And the males they were more on their own, and they didn't have access to so much wisdom. My theory on that is very, very simple. They're dudes. When you get a bunch of male teenagers together, the basic conversation is something like, is there anything dangerous and life-threatening around here we can do? And I had that streak for a while in my own life. I was very into a lot of risk-taking stuff, of whitewater canoeing and technical rock climbing and free climbing and mountain biking, and from a pretty early age. And I got hooked into motorcycling. From age 15, I'd always had a motorcycle. And if you haven't ridden, it's just so much fun. It's the closest thing to flying, really. The hills, the shifting, the counter steering, the whole thing is very, very cool. And it's also very, very dangerous. But it's very in the moment. It's like, this is fun, don't die. All happening at the same time. And I actually gave up my motorcycle when I moved here to D.C., primarily because distracted drivers, sitting in traffic with the fumes, the heat, just the fun kind of went out of it. And now that I haven't ridden for like the last 10 years or so, when I see people riding, I'm just terrified for them. Especially the people, in the sport bikes with flip-flops and running shorts. I mean, oh my gosh. But I chose that activity of motorcycling. But most of the anxiety that we experience is not chosen. It's baked into our culture, and it's baked into your nervous system. Anyone feel any anxiety today? At any given point? Yeah. So I'm curious, where did you feel it? Chances are through here. That's where we tend to hold it. Yeah. So on the one hand, anxiety is part of the natural function of your brain to keep you alive. It's a wonderful thing. There's a certain function of your brain and nervous system that is seeing potential threats and coming up with solutions to avoid pain and death. There's this little almond-sized part of the brain called the amygdala, and it's called the seat of fear. And there's one in each hemisphere of the brain. But I did some reading on this, and someone said, actually, it's not really the seat of fear, it's the seat of anticipation. So it's that part of your brain that is just full-time anticipation mode. Scanning, mostly for threats. And again, really, really helpful. It's kept our species on the planet for quite a while here. But on the other hand, as you know, when anxiety becomes chronic, it's quite debilitating. For your body, it's exhausting. Being in constant hypervigilance takes a lot of energy and stresses your entire system and affects your immune system, all of that. It affects your mind. Lots of studies now are showing that a lot of racial and religious intolerance comes because when people are in fear, they get locked into the familiar and afraid of the unfamiliar. We can certainly see that in our culture. And it leads to delusion. It leads to believing some things are true when they aren't, and some things aren't true when they are. And in terms of emotions, we see in our culture how we are so affected with social anxiety in our culture, and PTSD, hypochondria. The NIH did a study that said 18% of our population is afflicted with outsized fear in response to ordinary stimuli. I thought it's got to be more than that. And particularly when you begin to start paying attention to your mind, then you really begin to see how your mind is responding to your life and to what is changing. That's what this practice is all about. You become more and more aware of stimuli and response. And one of the great benefits of this practice is the gap between stimuli and response begins to open up a little bit when you cultivate your capacity for non-judging awareness. You have a little more time before you react. And instead of reacting, a little possibility of responding, which is a very, very different experience. So this anticipatory nature of the mind, how the amygdala is serving you, is part of the human experience, and it can be an ally. When you're driving, it's saying, hey, look out for that tree over there. Or it's saying, hey, you better do a little more preparation for that meeting next week. Or, it'd be good to have a little more money in your retirement account before you actually retire, It's self-protection. The question is, how do we work with it when it gets a little too dominant? So this leads to the question of, okay, so then what's the cause of anxiety? What's the root? There's a very, very simple teaching story that you may well have heard, but as simple as it is, it kind of sums things up. It's a story of a great and wise teacher, and his students were coming to pay their homage and give him gifts. And someone had made this beautiful, exquisite vase. And they gave the teacher this vase, and he looked at it, and they set it to the side, and then a strong wind came and blew it over, and the vase broke. And the person who gave him the vase was really upset. And the teacher said, it was already broken. So what is the root of anxiety? Well, to not waste your time, I just cut to the chase. This body you're in, it's going to get sick, going to get old, and it's going to die. Everyone you know and love, they're going to get sick, they're going to get old, they're going to die. Everything you love about your life, it's going to vanish. The reality is that all conditioned things are going to change and fall away. Your stress and your anxiety and suffering tends to arise when you forget that. Your stress and suffering, anxiety begins to arise when you find yourself defending this temporary sense of I and mine. And there's something about remembering and knowing that is part of the evolution of the brain. We all have some self-regulatory quality of our mind. That when you're going through a really tough time, something in your mind may say, it's okay, you've gone through this before. Or if you're finding yourself really stressed, there may be something in your consciousness that says, yes, this is painful, but other people are going through this too. That's the self-regulatory aspect of the brain, and primarily in the prefrontal cortex, which is really the evolving aspect of our brain from many perspectives. And of course, when you lose that self-regulatory aspect of remembering that all conditioned things fall away, well then we tighten up, we clench. Then we're very, very identified with this sense of I and mine, and in all the fear and anxiety that occurs in relationship to it. One way I like to think about this practice is it's a practice of remembering. in the meditation technique of mindfulness of the breath, it's called anapanasati. And the word sati means to remember. So when you're lost in thought, it's remembering, oh yes, the here and now. It's about remembering the basic laws of reality. It's about remembering, that's right, anything born out of causes and conditions is going to change. It's about remembering it's not actually what's happening, it's how I'm relating to it that is going to affect the degree to which I feel stress and suffering. It's about remembering that who you are is both relative and absolute. That yes, you are this body and mind and thoughts and all of your conditioning, and there's something about who you are that is unconditioned. And we taste that when we have that sense of non-judging awareness or non-judging presence, that sense of allowing. But perhaps even beyond the body-mind, there's something unconditioned about who you really are. So it's very helpful to see how oftentimes when you're caught in anxiety, there are some basic fears that are just baked in. It's the fear of failure, the fear of losing something, the fear of shame in relationship to those you know and love, the fear of sickness. Kind of the opposite of that are the desires that drive our lives. The desire to be successful or to be seen as a success, the desire to win or to be seen as a winner, the desire for fame, to be held in esteem by others, the desire for health and vitality. As I've said before, there are many, many incredibly successful people out there who are absolutely run by their fear of failure. Successful, but not happy. So this anxiety is such a part of our life. Jerry Seinfeld said that most people have listed that they're more afraid of public speaking than death. And he pointed out that means that the person giving the eulogy would actually prefer to be in the box. So then what's the remedy? How do you work with anxiety? And this is where I find it interesting, because what really interests me is the pragmatic stuff. How do you apply it when you're caught? And there are lots of ways to work with anxiety, but I'd like to share with you just one main specific exploration. Some of us are not so afflicted by anxiety. Some of us, it's more part of our conditioning. I think I had mentioned before, are you a one-day packer or a 5-day packer? A one-day packer, you just grab a bag and go. You figure it out as you go. 5-day packer has got everything you might need for every possible contingency. A lot of my conditioning has been around anxiety, and I've worked a lot with my own personal anxiety. And in many ways, a lot of the risk-taking I did earlier was really wanting to overcome my anxiety. So I sort of pushed myself to do things that were scary. And as I look back, I did a lot of really pretty dumb stuff. But now I'm more of a 5-day packer, more self-care. There's a beautiful TED Talk, which I'll share this from Tim Ferriss, where he talked about how his perspective was that instead of setting goals, we should really spend more time looking at our fears and sort of designing our life around our fears. And he sort of has a whole thing he does around the philosophy of Stoicism, which in many ways is it's realism. which is why I love this particular tradition so much, because it's reality based. It's not about wishful thinking, nor is it pessimistic, but like what's real. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I worked with someone about the particular questions that you can ask yourself when you find yourself caught in anxiety. And this was in regard to someone who was going to be going home to be with her mother. Her mother had an illness. They didn't know what her condition was. She was going in for more tests, and they didn't know the final diagnosis, but it probably wasn't going to be good. She was not close to her mother at all. She had a brother who was completely absent. And there was another sister who was kind of in an open feud with her mother. So she wanted to do the right thing. Even though she wasn't close to her mother, she arranged to take 2 weeks off to go back and to be with her. And she was incredibly anxious. And as she was describing her state of anxiety, at first she couldn't even locate it or even describe the bodily felt sense of it. It was more, she described it as just like a hypervigilance, like a heightened state of alarm. But when she began to sort of slow down and investigate like how her body was holding this whole event, she started to be able to describe it in a little more detail. It was like an ache in her chest. There was a clutch in her belly that just wouldn't let go. There are a lot of ways to explore what's between you and feeling free. And a very powerful way is just directly through the body. And we've talked a lot about that in the past, but this one's a little bit different. And I have found it so, as a basically someone whose way of being is anxious, I found this to be helpful. So the first question I asked her, and then I'll guide you through a little reflection if you'd like to try this on. I said, what are the top things you're most anxious about? What could go wrong? Let's call the anxiety out a little bit. So the first thing she said, I'm just going to get back into my old patterns with her. She gets really judgmental, and then I pull back, and then I get resentful, and then I get really mean toward her. And I'm just anxious that that's going to happen again, because it happens every time. The second thing she named was that she was really anxious about the possibility that her diagnosis could be really bad, and that she'd be the only person willing to spend time with her. And she'd have to move out there, and she'd lose her job and her relationships and her life, and everything she built would come crumbling down. It was all going to fall on her. And the third thing, as she sat with her, she said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it. I just think I'm going to fall apart. So those were her top 3. And those were really valid anxieties. And I pointed out to her that indeed these might happen. But if she was willing to look closer, we could explore actually how to be with them. And here, when we talk about sort of the essence of mindfulness practice, it's 2 questions. The first is, what is happening right now? Seeing it clearly. That's wisdom. And the second is, can you be with it, or how to be with it, which is the wing and the doorway to compassion. So we talked a little bit about her old patterns. So of the first one, that the old patterns would come back. And there are really 2 questions to explore. The first one is, well, what could you do to prevent that from happening? She thought about that. She said, well, I could do some extra sessions with my therapist to help me get a little clearer. I could write my mom and see if we could set up some ground rules. And then she thought about it. She said, even though my sister can't stand my mother, we're pretty close. And maybe we can talk about it. And we talked a little more, and she said, maybe I could do some metta meditation for her. Send her some compassion in advance of going. Maybe that would help. She was willing to do anything. So that was the first question. What could you do to prevent that? The second question, and again, this is reality-based. If it did happen, what could you do to correct it? So she thought about that. So if the old patterns came roaring back again, what could she do? And she said, well, I could have my therapist on speed dial. And as we talked more, she said, I could actually give myself permission to step away. I know exercise is really important. I can go to the local pool and get in a really good workout. And she thought, I could talk to my sister. So when we moved on to the next one, if the diagnosis was really bad and she needed more help and she felt like it was all going to fall to her, so what could she do to prevent that? Well, she couldn't stop the diagnosis from being bad, of course. But she realized she could check into some long-term care policies. She could investigate local support for her mother. And that she could check in with her siblings about creating financial support for her. And then you could just see the tension begin to melt. These were actually action steps that were moving directly toward the anxiety. If it did happen, we talked about that. And then she realized that she'd have to call her siblings, have a family meeting to really get real about how they're going to share responsibility. And she realized that conversation with her siblings, that she actually might need a facilitator, because it might not be easy. But then she realized, even though there was hurt and anger in her family, that her brother and sister were actually really good people and they wanted to do the right thing. Again, a little more anxiety melted away. And she realized that she'd have to negotiate with her family in order to make that happen. But then when she realized, I am not going to move out. I'm not going to give up the life I've created. There was something about the no that the color came back in her face. And she began to she realized that it was really empowering for her to say no, because it was really about saying yes to the life that she was creating. So then we moved on to the final of the sense that she wouldn't be able to do it. She'd fall apart. Well, in order to prevent that, she realized she needed to do everything she could to up-level her energy and her well-being. And that was her diet, meditation, emotional well-being, spending time with friends, have all of her support systems in place, and we talked about that. And then if it happened, how could she correct it? Well, permission to step away and to withdraw, having time with her allies. So by the end of that conversation, she had a very different relationship toward that sort of free-floating clench that something terrible was going to happen. And it was a direct result of her willingness to turn directly to the anxiety and to look at it really closely. And what I love about this process is that this is not magical thinking. The anxieties are real. Everything she mentioned could happen. They were possible and maybe even probable. But by directly looking at them, she was able to gain some insight. And quite often when we have that sense of free-floating anxiety and we don't look at it, it's just this deep clench that doesn't go away. But stopping, pausing, and turning is really the key. Tim Ferriss in his talk had something else he said, that when you're really looking at your anxieties, a good question to ask yourself is, has anyone ever in the existence of humanity, not as smart as me, figured this out? That's kind of helpful. So if you like, we'll do a little reflection, and you can just try these on. We'll take just a few minutes for this. So if you like, you can close your eyes, and you might just take a few moments to go through the files of just something in your life that is some source of anxiety, something that feels a little bit unsettled in your life. It's helpful if you make it real time. And it can be small or medium. Probably best not to do huge, just to try this on. And if you need a little more time to come up with something, you can raise your hand if you need a little more time. And I'll just offer these questions and give you a little time just to reflect on them. When you reflect on this event that is the source of some anxiety in your life, what would you say are the top 3 things that could go wrong? And as you explore these questions, let yourself just free associate, like you're making kind of a shopping list, and you can kind of evaluate later. When you reflect on the 3 things that might go wrong, what could you do to prevent it from happening in the first place? Is there anything you could do that would be preventative? And then exploring over the next minute or so, if any of these were to happen, what could you do to correct the situation? And if you could do that, what would that feel like on the inside? Then if you like, you can deepen your breath. And you can let your eyes open, if you like, or leave them closed. So that little inquiry may not all be tied up in a neat little bow, but it kind of gives you a sense of how you might explore those questions in regard to something that's kind of between you and feeling free or happy. One of the things about anxiety is, if you don't turn to address it or name it, it kind of becomes a monster. It becomes a demon. There's a New York Times article, a story of Sean Tucker, who had a 40-year career doing aerobic stunts at air shows. You know, the kind of ones where you can't quite believe they're doing it. And here's what he said. He said, "I never told anyone how scared I was when I started flying. But what I learned was that fear turns into a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if you have the courage to admit it, you'll be able to focus and prepare and rise above it." And that approach now is getting clinical validation. The capacity to actually name an anxiety changes your relationship in a way that allows you to see more clearly into the nature of it. This is the power of investigation. There's something called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is very, very effective. It encourages people not only to accept the fear and anxiety, but to examine their values and their commitments and strategies for how to work with that. And again, it's about seeing clearly and bringing in compassion or loving presence. Here's another interesting thing about the amygdala. I'll just read this from the article in the New York Times. Psychologists and neuroscientists are also finding out that the amygdala is less apt to freak out if you are reminded that you are loved or could be loved. For example, seeing images of people with frightening expressions is usually a huge trigger for the amygdala, but that response is greatly diminished when subjects are first shown pictures of people being cared for or hugged. Such a powerful thing. And again, when we talk about the science of the compassion practices, how powerful they can be in changing your entire nervous system, just to pause and reflect on kindness or loving presence, to make it real and personal, changes your whole nervous system. So this path, this whole approach is about looking into the nature of reality, just to see what's true. One of my best friends has built up a very big and a very complex business, and he's in the process of selling it. So there are big companies that are very, very interested, but they're also doing what big companies do, which is asking really hard questions and playing hardball with him. And my friend is the opposite of a pushover. He knows how to play the game, but he's also having huge anxiety. If this thing happens, if he sells it, it's going to be a huge win for him. You know, he'll be able to pay back his investors. He'll have some financial security. He'll be able to do what he really wants to do. If it doesn't happen, the whole company could go under. A lot of the investors will be angry. He'll never be able to raise the kind of money he's raised before, or he'll have to spend the rest of his life building up his reputation, which will be pretty much shot. So he called me this morning, and he said he woke up having an anxiety attack in the middle of the night with just absolute terror that this whole thing was going to fold. And he said, so I thought, well, let me try some of this inquiry crap that you're always talking about. And so he asked himself, well, so what's between me and feeling free right now? You know, you just feel this pulsing anxiety in his body. And then the approach he took was to really explore it in the body. So he said, well, where is it? And he said it was the longest time he couldn't find it, but then he could feel something in his chest. This pulsing, thumping, hot. There was something in there in his chest. So these two questions, what's happening? And can you be with it? So then he just became aware of that feeling in his body. He could actually locate where the anxiety lived on the inside. And he just asked this, well, what does this need? And then he waited. And he got, well, it doesn't need love. It doesn't need soothing. And he got, oh, it just needs to be seen. It just needs attention. And so it was like he just fed it attention. I see you, I'll be with you. And it melted. And he said, this is a really wonderful image. He said, this hot little thing in his chest, he said it was like this really powerful electric fan that just blew dust up everywhere. But as soon as he could sort of see it and acknowledge it and feel it, everything began to shift. And he said he actually slept quite well. Well, actually, he said, I slept like a baby. And I said, really? You woke up every 2 hours crying? Then he recorrected that. So there's a lot more to say, or a lot more at least I have written here. But really the essence of this practice, when you really want to be free, is recognizing that you'll see in more intimate detail how you are not free. And so much of the practice is about the courage it takes to turn toward that which is between you and feeling free. We live in such a stressful time right now. And when you find yourself in that grip of anxiety, one approach is to have tea with it. To really ask yourself, okay, what's the worst that could happen? And then, what could I do to prevent it? What could I do to correct it? And you may find some of the power of that anxiety may be taken away through that courageous conversation. And the other as well is to really acknowledge how, as they say, our issues are in our tissues. That when you can find that anxiety on the inside and to meet it with some quality of inquiry and loving presence, something can shift, which can be really quite wonderful. It really points toward the possibility of freedom in the midst of stressful times. So thank you for that rant on anxiety. A couple quick announcements before we go. I think I saw the tea and cookies headed that way. Just want to thank our wonderful, generous folks who saw this collection and wanted to support it with tea and cookies. That's there for you. Remember, yoga is happening. A really cool mindful discussion group happens after class right across from the restrooms. You can grab a cookie and tea and head over there. It's a great community over there. Also, a few words on karma. If by any chance, last week, you may have backed up into a 2016 blue Subaru Forester, you did little damage. And if you'd like to make sure you balance out the karmic balance sheet, check in with me and I can connect you with the owner of the car. Don't get anxious about it. It's all okay. Enjoy your tea and cookies. Thanks so much. I'll see you next week.